Hey, besties. Welcome to the Mixed Mercury Astrotherapy podcast, now hosting episodes on YouTube. So exciting. This is the first formally for YouTube episode that I've done so far. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Winter Taylor, Mixed Mercury himself, and I am a sidereal astrologer. What does that mean? It means that I exclusively use the sidereal zodiac, which places all of your astrological signs back about 24, 25 degrees. And so, what I like to tell people is the sun sign that you think you have in sidereal, it's probably the sign before, unless you're born on the cusp. If you're born on the cusp, you're probably staying the same zodiac sign. So, for example, my sun in tropical is Capricorn because I was born January 14th. But whenever I switch to sidereal, mine is still Capricorn because I was born towards the end of Capricorn season in the tropical zodiac. However, if I had been born, let's say January 11th, I would be a sidereal Sagittarius sun. So, in general, I like to tell people to just assume until you can pull your sidereal birth chart that you are the sign behind and that as I'm talking about placements, especially real time transits, just assume that everything is a sign behind. So for right now, the sun is transiting the sign Gemini and will be until about July 14th or 15th, something like that. So, anywho, what I like to do with the sidereal zodiac is combine astrology with psychology and sociology primarily, because that's what I got my degrees in. And I also like to add in elements of relationship coaching, which I recently got certified in as a level 1 relationship coach through the relationship school. And I also like to add in political and social commentary just as a way for us to relate. I think astrology is in everything. And because I have a love for the humanities and for the social sciences, I just think it's fun to combine it all and to use astrology really to articulate and narrate the experiences that we're having, along with maybe give us some insight into what is to come. As above, so below, I really believe that astrology does a good job of reflecting us back to ourselves, reflecting our experiences back to ourselves, so it's not so much that I think the sky is controlling us, so much as I think we are all moving in sync with the universe, and there are clues to help us deepen our perspective all around us. And astrology is just one of many ways to do that. So if all of that sounds good to you, I would love to talk to you today about Saturn stationary retrograde in Sidereal Aquarius. But first, I do have something that I want to show you if you haven't seen it before, and it is the Astrotherapy Journal. Maybe using a blue background wasn't the best idea for this, but we're going to go with it. You can use astrology in real time to basically track events in your life without needing to know all of the technical nuances and the nitty-gritty stuff about astrology. So I'll explain more in a separate video where I'll just talk about the journal, but for today, I want to show you the sticker sheets, which look like this. And if you can tell, there's actually one for the time that I'm doing this video. And it says June 26, 2024. We are having Mercury trine Saturn at 25 degrees Gemini and 25 degrees Aquarius. So what you would do is peel off the sticker and then you would apply it inside. Oop. It's all going to disappear. You would see it on you would paste it on the inside of your astrotherapy journal. So if you're a person that likes to journal and especially a person that likes to bullet journal, this is the product for you. Again, it allows you to just use astrology to keep track of your life events without having to basically pull a chart and see what's going on in the sky every time of the day. It has all major transits from May 2024 to May 2025. That is the full Jupiter and sidereal Taurus transit, and just kind of allows you to put yourself in the seat of the narrator and author as you are following your stories throughout the year. And then as time goes on and we start to reference certain dates that certain transits in the future will be attached to, you'll already have some insight into what that storyline is for you. So if that's something that interests you, head to my website. I will put the link in the description. That is mixedmercuryastro.com/shop. Okay, I have all of my introductions out of the way. Let me pull this chart for you. Let's talk about Saturn retrograde. Saturn is going to station retrograde this Saturday on June 29th, 2024. The exact moment will be about 1:42 p.m. Central Daylight Time if you live in the States. Saturn has been paused at 25 degrees Aquarius pretty much all month. It's slowing down in its orbit, and because of its respective movement to the Earth, it looks like it's moving backwards. What does it mean for a planet to station retrograde? So, not the retrograde movement, but the actual stationary period. This is especially important for the slower moving planets like Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. When a planet seems to be slowing down, stops, and is just paused in the sky. There's a lot of power, in a sense, in that moment. It commands all of us to pause and to stop and to reroute, in a sense. It's almost like if you were driving and you pulled up and realized that there was a wreck in front of you. And so you have to stop. Oftentimes you have to turn around or go down a different road, or you have to go a different direction because the direction you were going is just not available to you yet. There's something that you need to do or a different route that you need to take in order to get where it is that you're going. With Saturn in particular, the pause really speaks to our experience of reality. And that's because Saturn is a planet of reality. It's the planet that shows us or reflects back to us our experiences as they're happening, but without us adding any kind of personal narratives or perspectives onto it. It's the events themselves. And with Saturn in Aquarius in particular, this is actually about our experience of our own self concept. How do you think about yourself in your own mind? Like, whenever you think about yourself, if I were to think about myself as Winter, there's an image that comes up in my mind of who that person is, whether it's my literal reflection or whether it's the jobs that I do, the way that I show up in my relationships, the things that I'm good at or the things that I'm not good at. However it is that you conceptualize yourself, that's what Saturn in Aquarius represents. We don't just exist in a vacuum, right? Like we exist amongst other people who also see us and engage with us, and have a concept or an image of us in their minds as well. Sometimes the way that we think about ourselves is not necessarily in alignment with how we actually are, in reality or in a day-to-day basis. And then also sometimes the way that we think about ourselves is different than the way other people think about us, right? So it can get really existential if we really lean into it. But the point is, we all have a version of ourselves in our own minds. And when Saturn is doing its little retrograde dance in its own sign, Aquarius, the way that you think about yourself is changing in real time. The main planet that I want to talk about with regard to Saturn is Jupiter. In general, Jupiter is where we give meaning to our lives. And you can give meaning to yourself in a bunch of different ways, but for today, we're talking about Jupiter in Sidereal Taurus. In Sidereal Taurus, another fixed sign similar to Aquarius, is about how we kind of embody and materially perform our identity. And by perform, I just mean like how the person that you are shows up through your appearance, through the way that you dress, through the things that you like and that you enjoy, and also how you are perceived in your relationships. The relationships piece is especially important because Jupiter is currently ruled by Venus, and you know, Venus is our sign of relationship and connection, but also acceptance and approval. Approval is a big word for Jupiter in Taurus because this is kind of how we are making meaning out of our experience of ourself. is whether or not we believe other people approve of who we are or who we aren't. Now, I know dealing with things like validation and approval coming from external sources is something that culturally we kind of have a weird relationship with. We hear a lot of people saying that you shouldn't rely on other people's acceptance and approval and validation, that that should be something that comes from you internally. And while I agree that that's true to an extent, I think it's a both and because, like we were saying with Saturn, there is a version of us in our own heads, and then there is a version of us experienced by other people. And the thing that Jupiter and Taurus and that Taurus in general allows us to do is kind of change how we show up depending on the relationships that we're in. And what Jupiter does in Taurus specifically is allows us to give meaning to the way that we show up in particular relationships, or it allows us to make sense of ourselves and other people based on how we show up in relationship. So, in a more concrete sense, right, what does this mean? Imagine that you are applying for a job and you have to write your resume before you get an interview. So, what do? You have to write down all of the things that qualify you for this position or for this role at this company. When you're writing your resume, ideally, what you don't want to do is add in every single thing you've ever done, every single position you've ever worked, if it's not relevant to the job that you're applying for, right? It just doesn't make sense. You ideally want to have one page that you fit the most acceptable or the most relevant job experiences that you have so that you look like you're more qualified for the role that you're applying for. You're more likely to get hired if your employer doesn't have to spend hours sifting through a resume trying to figure out what is relevant to you performing this role and what isn't. This is kind of what Jupiter and Taurus allows us to do for ourselves. It asks us, okay, you've done all of these different things in your life. You've been all of these different versions of a person in your life. Which ones of these feel more like you in an authentic sense? And which parts of these things feel like maybe there are doctored up versions of you that are just a little bit more acceptable to the general public? And I know a lot of people can think that this is fake or this is manipulative or this is inauthentic, right? As much as we talk about not wanting validation and approval, people pleasing, stuff like that from other people, we also can't help but want to show people the best version of us, right? The version of us that we know is going to be accepted and the version that we know other people are going to like. And it also just doesn't make sense to be your quote most authentic self all the time, all day, every day. One, we just don't have the capacity to do that. It's kind of a big ask to be authentic every hour of every day. But there's also some benefit to performing a really pleasing version of yourself. You're not going to show up to a job and just be dressed in like how I'm kind of dressed, right? And just in your gym clothes, fresh out of a workout, still sweaty and stinky, and you just kind of look unprofessional. If the job that you're applying for is like a C-suite position at some major corporation, right? Like you want to put on your suit and your tie, whatever it is that's going to make you look the part of the job that you're applying for. But that doesn't mean that you have to look the part of this job that you play all the time, everywhere that you go. And it also doesn't mean that sometimes you can't go to the gym in your gym clothes and go work out. You want to tailor the way that you're showing up to the thing that you're showing up to or to the role that it is that you're trying to occupy in a given moment. I think sometimes we don't realize that there are parts of us that we can kind of put on and take off at will. I think sometimes we feel like we get boxed into certain identities or certain roles, even whenever we're not actively performing those roles. And that gets us tripped up in how we then start to think about ourselves. Remember, we were talking about our self concept with Saturn in Aquarius. What does all of this have to do with Saturn retrograde? Saturn and Jupiter are going to be doing this dance for the rest of the year and for the rest of the time that Saturn is in Aquarius, having us kind of recontextualize our self image. So, the longer that this goes on, and especially at the time of this retrograde, we're kind of realizing right now the limit of the identity or the version of ourselves or the concept specifically that we have of ourselves. And that it's not so much that there's parts of us that maybe we need to shed, because I think we've been doing a lot of shedding the last few years of parts of ourselves that feel inauthentic. But I think moving forward, we're realizing that maybe the version of ourselves that has been showing up is only one part, for lack of a better way to put it. I mean, it's not really much more profound than that. There are more selves that we need to kind of go back and retrieve and allow to participate in our lives along with us. So Saturn kind of has this way, I believe in the Vedic tradition, they believe that when planets retrograde, they kind of take on the opposing sign. And so in this case, for Saturn in particular, Saturn is performing a little bit more like Leo than it is Aquarius. And Leo is all about visibility and being seen and taking up space in the world. So with Saturn stationing retrograde, this would imply that we are making visible these other aspects of ourselves that maybe usually don't get to come out and be seen or be visible for one reason or another. And there are good reasons why we might hide different parts of ourselves. But for where we're going now, we've, again, like I said, Saturn being about limits as well. We've kind of reached the limits of what this version of ourselves can do. Now, there are ways that we have limited or experienced being limited that were out of our control. And there are some ways that are within our control. And I think that is what Mars in Aries is trying to help us do, especially after Jupiter was in the sign Aries all last year, basically from May 2023 to May 2024 of this year. What Jupiter in Aries was trying to help us do last year is help us recontextualize our power and our capabilities and what we are able to do um, with our personal power and autonomy and our strength of will. Because of kind of where we're at in real time, dealing with ongoing pandemic and disability, and also a lot of political oppression happening across a bunch of different identities, especially, super marginalized groups like trans people, Black people, queer people, and the disabled community. Like, we're realizing that there are some ways that we physically cannot do certain things because there are some real limitations that, we can't just overcome with a strength of will. And then there are other ways that we have been disenfranchised or maybe made to believe that we can't do certain things, whether that's politically or interpersonally or what have you, because of the narratives, the cultural narratives that are projected onto certain identities, which are partially due to our lived experiences and partially us assuming that certain things will happen should we try to step outside of the things that we've already seen people who look like us do. And that can go for anybody, not just marginalized identities, but especially marginalized identities, and also just anybody else who feels like they haven't seen some aspect of themselves represented in the general public or in the media. So there's a big way that we learn what we're capable of by seeing other people do it. And when we haven't seen other people do a thing that we want to do, it can be really hard to believe that that can actually exist or that it's actually possible. Now, Saturn in Aquarius is all about what's possible and what's, quite frankly, impossible. But what I like to think about Saturn in Aquarius in particular is that if you can imagine it, then to some extent it probably is possible. The challenge is how to make it possible. And I think that's a little bit how Saturn and Mars are trying to work together, at least at this time, and hopefully through the rest of this retrograde, based on this chart, where we have Mars in Aries. And Mars in Aries is very much like trying to prove that it can do a thing, whether anybody else believes that they can do it or not. So that's a little bit how Mars and Saturn work together to help us think outside of the box and to accomplish things that we didn't even think were possible, even if that means going about it in a way different than what we've seen be done before. The next piece I want to talk about that I haven't really thought about too much, so I'm going to do a little bit of thinking in real time, is the Sun and Venus in Gemini, while Mercury is fresh in the sign Cancer. So this is a big change. For one, the minute that Mercury has entered the sign Cancer, it's kind of setting us up for a Mercury retrograde, which I will do another video on later. But yeah, Mercury is going to do a retrograde dance between the signs Leo and Cancer, very similar to if you were paying attention last summer. Venus did a retrograde between Leo and Cancer as well. That was a really big deal. Mercury and Cancer is kind of setting us up to revisit some of those themes. And this is relevant because, like we said, Jupiter, who is helping us understand the roles that we need to play depending on the relationships and depending on the context, is waking up Venus again for us and kind of bringing up some of those themes from last year. But Venus at the time of this Saturn retrograde is in Gemini with the sun. Now, what I talked about a little bit in my last video about the full moon in Sagittarius, there's this idea that the names and the words that we use to describe ourselves in our relationships kind of informs some beliefs that we have about ourselves, if that makes sense. So if you haven't seen that video, definitely go watch it. It'll make the rest of this make sense. But something that I'm thinking about for this retrograde is really this idea that you can't be fully authentic to everyone all the time, every day, every minute of the hour. There's a discernment piece around these Gemini placements that are helping us see, okay, who are the appropriate people to reveal myself to? Who are the people who actually listen to me and believe me whenever I describe myself a certain way or when I use certain names to identify myself? Because the way that we speak about ourselves is important. We can't always just rely on the vision that we are projecting of ourselves, because sometimes what's going on the outside doesn't fully match how we feel on the inside. And it's not because we are lying or embellishing or anything like that, but it's just because some things are subjective, some things are internal, some things are a little bit more arbitrary and abstract. So we need words and we need language to describe how it is that we feel and how it is that we think about ourselves and conceptualize ourselves. But again, everybody doesn't share the same beliefs and narratives and stories that we assign to certain words. In fact, the meaning of words can vary greatly depending on the person that you're speaking to. And this can also create a little bit of internal and external conflict between how we see and think about ourselves and how other people see and think about us. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that Mercury trines Saturn today. And this is kind of a setup for this particular theme where everybody is just not going to be on the same page sometimes. And I think we have to get comfortable with that. Maybe comfortable is not the word, but we have to accept that. We have to accept that we're not going to be seen, heard, and validated by every person that we come into contact with or that we are in relationship with. And sometimes that just is what it is, which is a very Saturn thing, right? We can't control that with everybody, and that's okay. That is good information for us to know which version of ourselves is allowed to exist, or rather is safe to exist in certain relationships, and which versions of ourselves we probably need to hold a little bit more close to our chest, or that we probably need to protect a little bit more, depending on the relationships that we're in or the circumstances that we're in. And that's another reason why this retrograde, this Saturn retrograde, is asking us to see ourselves as more than just how we've been showing up to this point. We need to be able to access and retrieve a bunch of different versions of ourselves so that we can still feel like we exist in a variety of types of relationships. And this is tricky. This is not always something that is very straightforward or very easy to do. And I think there are times that it can feel like a little bit of a self-betrayal, right? To have to only be one version of yourself, only be a palatable version of yourself, depending on the situation that you're in. And I think the opportunity to allow a different part of you to be seen by somebody who maybe doesn't recognize you otherwise can still help preserve the relationships maybe that you're trying to preserve. It can help you last a little bit longer at that job that you probably hate. And it might even help you to seek out jobs and relationships or communities or just whatever it is, interests that you maybe previously didn't think you were qualified for or didn't think that you could fit into. So this is really about allowing for a more diverse self-concept, right? Allowing yourself to see different parts of yourself that have been suppressed for whatever reason and that don't get to take up much space in the world. I mean, it could very much be the case that you're so used to only being seen and validated in one way that now you introduce this other part of yourself and people are like, wow, I didn't even know that you could do this thing. I didn't even know that you were interested in this thing. I didn't even know this was something that was really important to you. And now you're giving people a chance to see and witness that in you. So there's a lot of opportunity here, guys. There's a lot of openness that can be experienced. There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of color that you can add to your life. And I think the last piece that I kind of want to land on is, what does this do for us emotionally? We do have two water placements in this chart. Both the moon is in Pisces, conjunct the North Node, and then we've also got Mercury, like we said, in Cancer, who's responsible for these Gemini placements. And what do water signs do? They bring us back into our body. They help us feel our feelings. They help us to connect with each other emotionally. And I think what this allows us to do, because I have a theory that the North Node being in Pisces is kind of asking us, calling on us to become more empathetic and calling on us to be more intuitive and compassionate towards other people. Even if we can't fully identify with them or see ourselves reflected in other people in an identity sense, we're still all humans, right? We still have our humanity in common. And the more that we can allow different parts of ourselves to come forward, the more we get access to different parts of our emotional selves as well. Last year, with that Venus retrograde that we were talking about between Leo and Cancer, a lot of what we spoke about had to do with emotional capacity and emotional availability. And one of the things with that is whenever you spend so much time, we'll say outside of your body, just trying to perform a role and kind of focusing a little bit more on how everybody else feels, you lose touch with your own inner reality and you lose touch with your own inner emotional experience. In just like you get stuck playing or embodying a particular role, you can get stuck in a particular emotional expression as well, which I very much think Mercury in Cancer is about, how we express ourselves emotionally. So the kind of question that you can ask yourself, at least during this time, during this retrograde, is whenever I perform a different version of myself or I allow a different version of myself to come forward to be witnessed and experienced by other people in relationships, what other emotions does that give me access to? So maybe you're the type of person who spends a lot of time in grief or in sadness or in depression or anxiety. And whenever you allow this other part of yourself to come forward and be witnessed by other people, you can be held in those feelings and it makes room for you to feel maybe more joy or maybe more excitement and enthusiasm or curiosity, even towards yourself and others and towards life. Or if you're used to only experiencing this kind of shallow and superficial version of gratitude and joy that maybe isn't fully authentic to how you actually feel about the current circumstances, when you allow these other parts of yourselves to be seen and witnessed by other people, how does that allow you to access maybe your anger or your frustration or your disappointment or dissatisfaction, even with how life is and your circumstances are going? Because again, we need both. We need all of these feelings to kind of give us this, again, a diverse emotional landscape in our bodies and in our spirits that allows us to connect even more with other people, even if we can't directly identify with maybe a struggle that they're experiencing or a joy that they're experiencing, right? So all of these placements are kind of working in service to help us see ourselves a lot more deeply and a lot more authentically than just the particular way that we think we're supposed to show up or a particular way that we think is the most acceptable and palatable to everyone else. I think that is all that I want to say about this transit and the season that we're moving into. I hope that this kind of clears the path forward for you and inspires you to start thinking about yourself a little bit differently. Maybe doing some inner child work or some shadow work, or getting into old hobbies and just seeing how that makes you feel, or reflecting on old photos and going through old photo books, or I don't know, cleaning out your closet and just seeing what's in there, clothes that you used to wear, um, or cooking foods that you used to enjoy, things like that. Just allowing these other parts of yourself to come forward, like I've said a dozen times in this video, and just see what happens. Become curious about who you are. Become curious about who you've been before. And then whenever you start to allow these selves to come forward, what does that make possible for you moving forward? What does that open up for you in terms of things that you didn't think you were capable of before, or things that you didn't think you could accomplish before? How does that allow you to ask for help where you need it, to invite in relationships with other people as you need them, and to um, just start to build stronger relationships with both yourself and with others? If anything that I've said today is something that you want to understand a little bit deeper in the sense of how it impacts your personal chart, I have plenty of readings available also on my website. The most popular for things like this are the WTF is happening in the sky reading, which I have plenty of availability for. You can also take a look at your personal year ahead to see if any of these placements are your personal planet and Lord of the year, and how this planet is helping you to come into right relationship with yourself. And then if you want to become a regular coaching client of mine, whether that is astrotherapy coaching or relationship coaching, I also have some spots available for regular clients as well. You can book packages, or you can just see me regularly every 2 weeks to work on whatever personal goals and personal development goals that you have for yourself during this retrograde. So, yeah, I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to speaking to you next time. Again, my name is Winter, and I don't have an outro yet. So for now, peace and blessings. I will talk to you next time.